Floyd Chapman's service in the Second World War was probably unlike that of any other Toledoan and most other Americans. And if there were 40,000 Toledoans who served in the Second World War, there were 40,000 very different stories. Chapman's gets unique. He was a musician in Toledo before the war, playing the saxophone. He gets drafted into the Coast Guard and becomes a Coast Guard musician. The Coast Guard then gets an idea. What if we make a fighting band? They form a band called the Amphibians, a jazz and popular music band. They train the men together as a band. They travel all over the country in publicity shows. And then they get trained to drive the assault craft on D-Day. Chapman and his band play on the deck of a troop ship called the Samuel Chase as the troops head over to D-Day on the night of June 5th and 6th, 1944. Then, after playing their songs to keep the guys' spirits up, they put down their instruments and they board the assault boats to get ready to drive the 1st Infantry Division onto Omaha Beach for D-Day. Again, if there's 40,000 men in the war, there's 40,000 different stories. And it's almost impossible to figure out which stories to share with you guys here because there are so many amazing stories of just the Toledo people who served in the European theater of World War II. Today, we're going to take a deeper dive into the European theater and how things played out in the first 3 years of the war. Toledoans contributed in every phase of the war. And in a lot of ways, those contributions in the European theater were so much more conspicuous than anywhere else. And if any of these stories interest you at all, I really encourage you to take the World War II elective class through the distance learning program in TPS. It's open to juniors and seniors. It's an honors credit, and it really gives you a chance to explore both the history of the Second World War and the history of Toledoans in the Second World War in greater detail. So that's kind of my sales pitch for that. Let's talk for just a few minutes real quickly about the broad strokes of the war in Europe. So the big picture is this. Roosevelt and Churchill meet in the first months of America's involvement in the war up on the North Atlantic coast. We agree with the British on a Germany first strategy that yes, we're at war in Europe and in the Pacific, but we're going to focus on Germany first. Many Americans were not happy with this because it was Japan that attacked us, Japan that got us into the war. But there were good reasons for this. The United States cannot win this war on its own. We need Great Britain and we need Russia / the Soviet Union because winning is nearly impossible without them both. One of the kind of fallacies people fall into talking about the Second World War is, well, they couldn't have won without America, or in the Soviet Union, well, you could not have won without us. And the British, like, well, none of you would have won without us. All of those things are true, and none of those things are true. This was a true team effort, and we'll talk about how that gets complicated in a little bit. But it's true. The war likely would not have been won without American contributions. It is also true it could not have been won without Britain. It is also true it could not have been won without the Soviet Union. Every ingredient was critical in this. And we needed both of those countries to stay alive if we had any hope at all of coming out victorious in this war. We also needed time. The United States was in no way ready to fight a war in 1941/early 42. We needed time to build up forces and build up equipment for the big fight and the big showdown, which everyone knew was going to be the invasion of Europe and the push to Berlin. So, this starts with what we call the Battle of the Atlantic, and lots of Toledoans served in the Battle of Atlantic. They served as Coast Guardsmen on Navy ships. They served as merchant marines on cargo ships, and they served in the Navy in the destroyers and destroyer escorts that helped get ships across. They served in the air forces, helping cover the ships as they got off the American coast. This battle rages in the North Atlantic for 3 years. German submarines were targeting Allied cargo ships because they knew those cargo ships are the only thing keeping Britain alive And they are what's building up this Anglo-American force to eventually invade Europe. The Germans initially have a lot of success. German submarines hunted in wolf packs. They would target stragglers and weak ships. They would sink these ships. Millions of dollars of equipment, not to mention the men, are lost in these attacks. And it makes it harder to prosecute the war. But after a year of the German successes, the Allies adopt a lot of strategies to neutralize the threat. So sailing in tightly packed convoys with the destroyer escorts out around the edges to protect the convoy, the weaker convoy ships. These escort ships really make a difference. Sonar, an early version of sonar goes online to help locate the German submarines and then direct fire on them. And so by the time we get to late 43, early 44, there are still American ships sunk by the German submarines, but those numbers are decreasing all the time. There are problems in an alliance, as I alluded to earlier. Everybody in the alliance comes in with their same goals. Every nation has its own goals. Every nation has its own way of fighting a war. Now, in 1941, no country has absorbed losses. By the time we get to December of 41, no country has absorbed more losses than the Soviet Union. And when we get into the Americans really being part of the alliance in 1942, the Soviets start making demands. And they say, look, we're losing millions of people every couple of months. You guys need to directly attack Germany immediately, because that will force the Germans to pull troops off of this eastern front. If you guys attack over here, it will force them to pull soldiers back and give us a chance to put some kind of offensive together to win this war. America understood that. Britain understood that. We've got to do something to pull the pressure off Stalin. Then the disagreement becomes what? What do we do to pull the pressure off of Stalin? The United States wanted an attack right across the English Channel. We wanted to do it right away. We had one plan to do it in 42, another plan to do it in 43. We wanted to make that immediate attack across the channel as quickly as possible. The British said, no way. They had tried an attack across here at a place called Dieppe with Canadian troops. It was an utter disaster. The British have no interest in making an attack across the channel. The British say, what if we make an attack in the Mediterranean? We attack into Italy, we attack into Greece, we attack through Yugoslavia. They did not want to hit in the strongest point. They saw the Mediterranean as the soft underbelly. And then you will fight your way through Italy, through all these mountains, through another set of mountains, all the way up to Berlin. That's what the British want to do. Everyone agrees something has to be done in that first year in 42, but the disagreement is on what we're going to do. So this brings us to North Africa. The United States makes a conscious decision to get involved in the war in Europe through England's war in North Africa. So in the fall of 1942, American troops land in Morocco and Algeria to help strengthen a British desert force that was fighting across the north of Tunisia and Libya and Egypt at the time. We engaged German forces, we engaged Italian forces, and forced them to withdraw across the channel back to Italy. The next item of business then is going to be following them across the Mediterranean and following them to the island of Sicily. Sicily, of course, is the ball that's being kicked by the boot of Italy. So in the summer of 1943, the Americans and the British retake Sicily. And the British still want an invasion of Italy. They still want to hit at the soft underbelly. America is really hesitant to do this. We still want to try that cross-channel invasion. But we agree to keep the alliance alive. We're going to do what the British wanted to do here. At the same time, the Americans and British are fighting together on a different front, and that is the front over Europe. American and British bomber offensives targeted German industrial areas. The idea was, if we can blow up the plants that are making German tanks, German guns, German ammunition, German airplanes, we can weaken their ability to wage war. Sometimes these targeted missions failed, especially when we had a night bombing offensive. The British led this attempt to bomb at night. And it was hard to hit precision targets at night. It was hard to hit precision targets when the weather was bad. So then the Allies turned to what they called area bombing. And area bombing was basically drawing a box and saying, we're going to drop enough bombs to destroy everything in this box. This was an incredibly controversial method of waging warfare. And ultimately, it wasn't that effective. German production actually went up during the height of the air war in 42, 43, and 44. They actually made more war material during this bombing as they got better at distributing out their supply chains and better at hardening the targets that were their most important parts facilities. All of this leads to D-Day, which is probably the thing you're the most familiar with. D-Day is June 6th of 1944, and it's the invasion of mainland Europe. It's that final punch across the English Channel that everybody has wanted since the beginning of American involvement. You're going to invade France to push into Germany. D-Day is one of the most complex military operations ever attempted. More than 6,000 ships were required, 15,000 aircraft, and about 400,000 soldiers, sailors, and airmen are required in the first 2 days alone. It showed the difficulties of amphibious landings, landing on these long beaches with big cliffs overlooking in small boats where the men are easily targeted as they exit. It was very difficult, but ultimately very successful. The D-Day landings were deadly, but they were successful. They were probably more successful than anyone had any right to believe they were going to be. Within a few months, it takes about a month and a half for the Allies to break out of this Normandy area and then really get the ball rolling towards the German border. Within a few months, they make it to Paris, the liberation of France. You can see the Arc de Triomphe in the background here as the Allied troops move through. And by September of 1944, much of France and Belgium is liberated. Then there's a real question. How do we push across the border from France into Germany? And there are a number of ultimately unsuccessful attempts happening in the fall of 44. In the south, in the Vosges Mountains of France, they try to push through the mountains into the region of Germany and France's border called Alsace. Up in the region called Lorraine, there is a push through what's called the Hürtgen Forest. That ends up being the deadliest American encounter of the European theater in World War II. And then in September, there is a chance up in the Netherlands to push way into the Netherlands and get around the German defenses called Operation Market Garden, and that too is a failure. We must talk about the Eastern Front for just a moment. The Eastern Front, or Soviet Front, is all the fighting happening between Germany and the Soviet Union. The Soviets took monstrous losses. Here in the United States, our death toll from combat in all of World War II was about 291,000 people. About 400,000 Americans died total when we count accidental deaths in it, but about 291,000 combat deaths. The Soviets are going to lose about 40 million people in the war. There is just no frame of reference we have in the United States for the kind of deaths that the Soviet Union took in their 5 years of World War II. They are grinding the German army into smithereens after a battle called Stalingrad in the winter of 42-43. They're just grinding the German army as they push them back towards German territory. And as I said before, everybody was necessary in this war, but perhaps nobody was as necessary as the Soviet Union. Had they not basically traded space and lives for time, there's not enough opportunity for the British and the Americans to attack from the West. The Soviet losses are just grave and monstrous in this war. That kind of brings us through the first few years of America's war in Europe. And in our next video, we'll look at the war in the Pacific, and then we'll come back to the war in Europe and come back to the war in the Pacific to understand how these wars were wrapped up in the end. Thanks a lot for being with me, and be well.